You're a 14-year-old girl from a small village on the Danube River. You awaken one morning to the beat of hooves, pounding down your town. By nightfall, your world has been shattered, your family severed, and you're bound into a wagon, bound for a worse death. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire spanned 3 continents, with control over the fate of millions. We recall the resplendent mosques, the mighty sultans, and the strategic genius that constructed one of the greatest empires in history. But behind the golden domes and marble palaces was a systematic human trafficking and sex exploitation network that functioned with nightmarish efficiency. What you are about to learn is from Ottoman administrative documents, eyewitness accounts by European diplomats, and archaeological data that explain how an empire redefined the enslavement of women as a pillar of imperial strength. These weren't random events or tragic side effects of war. They were deliberate policies that commodified millions of women, their bodies exchanged like silk and spices on gigantic commercial circuits. The procedures we'll discuss weren't sinister backroom operations or carried out by renegade bureaucrats. They were formalized systems that were professed to in Ottoman literature, governed by law of the empire, and recorded with the same officious attention applied to the collection of taxes or the organization of military campaigns. Everything was meticulously accounted for by the empire, including detailed lists of slave women, pricing mechanisms for various types of captives, and administrative protocols for handling what they referred to as their human livestock. But first, if you like reading about the less desirable pages of history textbooks tend to gloss over, do subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us make more content like this. Now let's start with the systematic process by clicking which free women became imperial property. The capture phase functioned like a smooth military machine. Ottoman armies did not conquer only land. They gathered human beings with scientific accuracy. Women were graded into categories even before the wars ceased. The youngest and prettiest were separated at once and reserved for imperial harems. Older women were assigned to domestic slavery or agricultural labor. Children were assessed for value in other markets within the empire. The psychological warfare immediately commenced. Naked conquered women were paraded through towns, not only to humiliate them but to showcase Ottoman strength to local populations. Public humiliation served various purposes. It shattered the captive spirits while frightening communities into submission. It also enabled Ottoman authorities to make initial appraisals, screening women like merchants, assessing bolts of fabric. The transportation systems that carried these cargoes of humans were as advanced as any business operation. The empire had specialized caravans with chains, cages, and medical equipment to preserve their commodities during prolonged trips to slave markets. Itineraries were selected to preclude rescue attempts and maximize the survival rates of expensive captives. The most expensive women rode in covered wagons to safeguard their complexions from exposure to the sun that could lower their market price. But the real horror was not in the capture or transit. It was in what occurred when these women arrived at their destinations. The slave markets of Constantinople were as efficient as contemporary shopping malls. Women were paraded upon elevated platforms where potential purchasers could inspect them as one would shop for cattle. Dealers kept precise catalogs with information regarding age, provenance, physical characteristics, and approximated fertility. The highest-priced category was reserved for what the Ottomans referred to as trained courtesans, who were women processed through specialized workshops that took traumatized captives and turned them into refined sexual goods. These training schools were possibly the most organized system of psychological reconstruction ever conceived. New recruits went through a process that was meant to eradicate their former selves entirely. They were assigned Ottoman names, prohibited from speaking their own languages, and coerced into Islamic religious practices. Dissent was punished progressively from beatings to starvation to public execution, as warnings to other prisoners. The psychological process of breaking followed tried methods honed over centuries. Women were kept separated from anyone who spoke their language or came from their background. They were made to fight among themselves for things as simple as food and shelter. The empire worked consciously to encourage rivalries and suspicion among captives, so the natural solidarities between people were tainted into instruments of destruction against each other. Those who successfully adjusted learned to do obeisance for their enslavement. They were instructed in elaborate rituals of subjugation, schooled to be grateful for being selected to serve their Ottoman masters. The best working graduates of the system frequently served as gatekeepers responsible for processing new arrivals. their own trauma became mechanisms for breaking others. The economic infrastructure behind the trade was immense in breadth and complexity. The empire had sophisticated pricing systems that varied according to supply and demand between regions. African captives were commanded a lower price by European women. Non-virgins were much cheaper than virgins. Young girls fetched top prices that might equal the value of entire estates. Market accounts reveal the hard numerals of human commodification. A Balkan girl would cost 3,000 axes if she were to be kept for household labor. If her fate were to be sexual servicing, however, she might fetch 10 times that amount. The highest price range was for imperial harems, where single women would fetch sums equivalent to a small fortune. The empire's legal framework gave these women no protection at all. Islamic law by and large sanctioned the sexual exploitation of female slaves by their masters. Women could be raped over and over without recourse to the law. If they became pregnant, their children were entirely owned by their masters, who might sell them, kill them, or use them as they pleased. Enslaved women's sole protection was their economic worth, which gave owners a modest reason to preserve their lives and keep them fairly healthy. But the system demanded more than legal codes. It demanded cultural acceptance, and the empire found that through systematic indoctrination that commenced in childhood, Ottoman children were raised in a world where human trafficking was on every street corner. Young people were taught that bodies could be bought and sold like any commodity. Generations were raised to view sexual slavery as not a barbarian behavior but the natural order of things. The educational system of the empire promoted these attitudes with religious teaching that described enslaving infidels as ordained by God. The kids were instructed to regard using captive women for sex as a reward for loyal service to the state. Religious scholars wrote authoritative treatises on the treatment of female slaves, including in-depth discussions of sexual practices and breeding strategies. The breeding schemes that Ottoman administrators undertook demonstrate the organized nature of this exploitation. Slave women were picked for their ability to give birth to children with desirable traits. They were coerced into sexual relationships with individual men appointed by their owners, establishing bloodlines of slaves bred for a specific purpose. Some were bred for physical beauty to be used in harems. Others were bred to be strong to work as domestics or as field hands. The record of these practices is in gruesome detail because the Ottomans were fastidious about their records. They kept account books recording the ages, backgrounds, and costs of slaves. They took inventory of palace harems, cataloging women as pieces of furniture or livestock. They kept correspondence between officials discussing procurement methods and the sexuality of their superiors. These documents remain today in repositories throughout Turkey, and they represent irrefutable proof of wholesale sexual exploitation that functioned for centuries. The bureaucrats of the empire even recorded their crimes with the same meticulousness they applied to military strategy or building designs. They had no sense of shame in what they were doing because they dwelled in a culture that had thoroughly institutionalized the sexual exploitation of defeated peoples. The size of this human trafficking network was absolutely mind-boggling. Archaeological digs in medieval Islamic cities uncover slave markets that functioned as commercial areas with specialized stalls for different types of human merchandise. Women were divided up by function and age perception. The youngest girls, some of whom were scarcely beyond childhood, were placed in special quarters where they were prepared for roles against every natural impulse of human protection. The empire had built assembly lines for treating human beings with each step optimized to earn the highest profit while minimizing the likelihood of resistance or escape. Psychological manipulation used at these camps was advanced beyond anything done in past civilizations. New inmates were intentionally shown the sight of women who had been longer in the system, observing their seeming happiness and submission. These performances were highly scripted spectacle intended to persuade newcomers that acceptance was not just possible but desirable. The process of breaking included methodical separation from anything known. Women were being accommodated with others who had different languages, stopping the creation of support groups that could enable resistance. They were assigned new names that did not have any similarity to their birth names, and harsh punishments awaited anyone found using their actual names or talking about their past lives. Food became a tool of oppression, with meals being offered as rewards for obedience and withdrawn as punishment for disobedience. The empire had learned that hunger could achieve what physical force could not by itself, inducing a state of dependency that made the captives thankful for the slightest favors. Those who acquiesced quickly enjoyed a little more comfortable living situation, making others' emulation attractive. The training routines were protracted and humiliating. Women were taught intricate toilet rituals, memorized Turkish and Arabic phrases, and rehearsed mannerisms intended to appease future masters. They were instructed in how to walk, talk, and even breathe for maximum attraction to prospective buyers. The empire had created curricula to turn human beings into sex products, as elaborate as any college course. Medical checks were standard and intrusive, carried out by doctors who tested women like veterinarians test animals. Tests for fertility decided who among women would be sold as prospective mothers. Beauty evaluations dictated pricing systems. Screens for health guaranteed that products would last long enough to give fair return on investment. The most chilling was the way the system generated its own perpetrators. Surviving women who had aced the breaking and showed excellent compliance were elevated to supervisory status. They were useful in processing the new arrivals. Their own trauma was repurposed into skill at causing the same psychic damage to others. The empire had established a self-sustaining cycle of victims turned victimizers. The geographical reach of this network was far broader than Ottoman frontiers. The empire had procurement arrangements with slave traders throughout Africa, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. Professional merchants followed established routes, aggregating human commodities from territories desolated by war or economic disaster. These traders worked similarly to contemporary human trafficking syndicates with evolved logistics and corrupt official networks to ease their operations. The need was endless and always changing. Styles in Constantinople dictated which women were most desirable. Politics determined which regions yielded the most valuable captives. Economic conditions altered pricing, but never decreased the number of exchanges. The empire had established a market so strong that it endured wars, epidemics, and leadership changes. Quality control systems were in place throughout the system. Women who did not reach standards were rejected or sent to secondary markets at discount prices. Those that surpassed expectations were sold at premium prices and reserved for the upper echelons of Ottoman society. Sophisticated grading systems had been established by the empire that denigrated human beings into standardized products with reliable market values. The bureaucratic machinery that serviced this commerce had thousands of officials upon whose careers its perpetuation depended. Clerks kept precise accounts of stock and sales. Inspectors verified standards of quality. Guards kept people from escaping and keeping facilities in order. The empire had fashioned a whole bureaucracy committed to the scientific dehumanization of women. The cultural legacy went far deeper than with the impact on the direct victims. Families in invaded lands were perpetually terrorized by the fear of their daughters being chosen for collection. Parents came up with last-ditch plans to safeguard their children, such as marrying them off at ridiculously young ages, or actively scarring them so as to make their daughters less appealing to Ottoman collectors. The empire had traumatized entire populations through the threat of selection alone. The emotional harm that was done to surviving women was deep and long-lasting. Those who finally achieved liberty tended to be unable to establish normal relationships or trust others. Many were so well indoctrinated that they were unable to imagine life outside the system that held them. The empire had produced human beings dependent psychologically on their own exploitation. The economic gains were huge and kept the empire growing for centuries. Human trafficking profits subsidized military expeditions, palace building, and administrative growth. Wealth from enslaved women subsidized the architectural wonders we now associate with Ottoman civilization. The empire had established its golden age on pillars of systematic sexual exploitation. But the most haunting aspect was how comprehensive this system had become embedded in everyday Ottoman life. Citizens found the presence of chained women in markets as commonplace as any other business transaction. Children were raised among the enslaved and learned to consider human ownership as normal and proper. The empire had established a civilization wherein the total commodification of human sexuality was not only accepted but celebrated as an indicator of imperial prosperity. The global reaction shows how this system tainted diplomatic relations throughout Europe and Asia. Foreign diplomats reported in some detail on the human trafficking they saw, but presented these observations in terms of cultural differences, not as a humanitarian crisis. European powers that could have intervened were too heavily invested in Ottoman trade relationships to endanger diplomatic relations over the lives of enslaved women. The economic power of the empire enabled it to spread these practices abroad, with client states and trade partners implementing similar human exploitation systems. The process of normalization was so thorough that even victims started to adopt the logic of their own commodification. Women who had been slaves for years would judge new arrivals based on the same standards their owners applied, unwittingly reinforcing the system that had ruined their own lives. The empire had done something unique in human history, making victims who worked together to victimize others. The new technologies that were created to manage enslaved people show the organization of this oppression. Restraining devices were created to make escape difficult, while limiting visible harm that could lower market worth. Conveyance vehicles were designed to hold as many people as possible, while sustaining survival rates over extended travel periods. Medical tools were engineered especially for the invasive procedures that established pricing and placement. The empire even had architectural guidelines for slave housing that achieved cost-effectiveness while ensuring human merchandise would be kept in saleable condition. Such facilities were built with the same care as any other commercial infrastructure, including drainage systems, ventilation needs, and security features that rendered escape nearly impossible. The record-keeping was maniacally precise, with the bureaucrats monitoring not only fundamental data but advanced information regarding preferences, performance, and profitability. Individual women received identification numbers and were traced throughout their lives within the system. The empire had databases that would be comparable even to the standards of today, all devoted to the effective administration of human misery. The training programs grew more specialized as the empire developed its techniques over the centuries. Various facilities gained experience in the creation of women for particular markets. Some were geared to training household servants, others produced concubines for merchants, and the most exclusive institutions prepared women for imperial harems. Each institution established its own course schedule based on market conditions and customer input. The graduation exercises from these institutions were lavish ceremonies commemorating the successful conversion of human persons into commodities. Women who had finished their training were paraded like pieces of art, their obedience and expertise showcased for future buyers. The empire had made the annihilation of human dignity into entertainment for the rich. The feedback mechanisms were advanced, with buyers set to report on how well their purchases performed. This data was employed to hone training techniques and modify procurement procedures. The women who performed poorly could be returned as defective merchandise, being punished as examples for others in the initial stages of training. The empire's quality control strategy involved routine inspections of training schools, standardized testing protocols, and performance measurements that boiled human beings down to points on a spreadsheet. Supervisors were measured in terms of their rate of success in creating compliant and marketable women. The whole system hummed along with the precision of any successful business operation. The psychological experimentation done under this system was widespread and systematic. Ottoman administrators examined which methods best shattered resistance, which inducements promoted cooperation, and which sanctions discouraged uprising. This information was formalized into instructional manuals that were disseminated to institutions throughout the empire, providing uniform outcomes no matter the location. The investment by the empire in this system was vast, with huge resources being allocated to facilities maintenance, staff training, and the creation of new control methods. The yield on this investment was deemed vital to imperial budgets, with human trafficking income being included in budget forecasts and economic analysis. Systematic exploitation of women had become a pillar of Ottoman fiscal policy. The long-term planning was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. The empire anticipated future demand for enslaved women, based on plans for expansion, demographic projections, and economic predictions. Procurement strategies were planned years ahead in order to have sufficient supplies of human merchandise to meet projected market demand. The bureaucrats running this system planned in decades, not seasons. The success of the empire in this regard also shaped its military tactics, with campaigns being organized in part with reference to their potential for human acquisition. Provinces with reputations for yielding exceptionally valuable women were priority conquest targets. The systematic enslavement of population was accounted for in terms of cost-benefit dynamics of warfare, with anticipated revenues from slaves providing justification for the costs of war. The cultural glorification of such practices was widespread and public. Ottoman literature featured rich accounts of stunning enslaved women, handling their pain like entertainment for readers. Poets wrote verses to glorify the purchase of captives, while historians documented the institutionalized exploitation of vanquished populations as a measure of imperial triumph. The empire had cultivated a whole cultural apparatus that celebrated human trafficking. Ottoman practices created the legal precedents, followed by legal systems throughout the Islamic world for centuries. The elaborate rules governing the treatment of slave women developed into model laws that other rulers duplicated to initiate similar systems. Legal innovations in human exploitation throughout the empire diffused far beyond its borders, causing permanent harm to legal traditions across several civilizations. The Ottoman Empire's institutionalized exploitation of women is one of history's most extensive cases of institutionalized dehumanization. For more than 6 centuries, tens of millions of women and girls were turned into commodities in a bureaucracy that was run with precision and celebrated by culture. These were not aberrations or unavoidable byproducts of war, but rather policy choices that made human trafficking a cornerstone of imperial strength. The proof lies in the archives throughout Turkey, recorded by their own hands by the perpetrators, who found nothing dishonorable in their systematic desecration of human dignity. To comprehend this history is not to judge contemporary nations, but to understand how power systems can corrupt even the most basic parts of human existence, and to prevent such systems from ever blooming again.